the challenge with indie for a lot of people is they, either in the way we position it or the way that the market projects itself onto us, is they think indie's about fundraising. And indie has never been about fundraising. Indie's more about focusing on the things you can control, focusing on insulating yourself from the things you can't control. And the things we've seen over and over again have been that the more you focus on the actual things that matter, the funding follows. So rather than sitting around trying to convince somebody that a thing is going to be a thing, just go do the thing, I think people would be surprised at how much investor interest that ends up generating, how many resources down the road that can unlock. I mean, we're going through that with a company right now, where when we close our round of funding with them, it was their intent to never raise another round of funding. They just wanted to focus on this technology they cared about and getting it out into the market. Something pretty magical happened. Rather than worrying about like what the next fundable milestone was or what investors needed to see, they just exclusively spent time with customers. Those customers lined up, and they lined up in ways that pretty soon overwhelmed them with the resources they had. As that started to happen, word started to spread, investors started to hear about them, entrepreneurs started to chatter in their own circles. Oh! Can I help? Let me pull that up. Yeah, that's now a sale. They started having VCs reaching out. They didn't have to go take dozens and dozens of like get to know you coffees and always be raising bull crap. They just locked in on their customers. And the more they told VCs they didn't need their money or they didn't want their money, the more VCs wanted to give it to them. And so ultimately, they were able to not only get exactly the partner they wanted for their next round of funding, they were able to get it on terms that looked a whole lot like they skipped a round of funding or two based on the amounts and valuations. And because of that focus, they also ended up with an actual business that has some markings of product market fit and ultimate scale. But that was a result of where they focused their energy. I think that was a real testament to me, especially as we kind of enter, what we've been calling this indie era, that, that companies who really focus on the right things get rewarded in ways that maybe seem less obvious. And I think we've kind of trained the last generation of entrepreneurs to really focus on the obvious, to focus them on the fundable milestones versus the ultimate end state that they're building towards. And I think that introduces a lot of funny incentives. It introduces a lot of noise and distraction into the process of ultimately trying to birth a company that has massive impact. With indie, it's just how do you quiet as much of that noise as possible, right? How do you tune out as much of that noise as possible and focus that energy on those things that'll have the longest term, highest impact. Fundraising for so many have become the goal instead of, what the ultimate outcome should be. It reminds me of that quote from my old partner, Tim O'Reilly, where he talked about, a road trip isn't a tour of gas stations. And yet we've kind of turned entrepreneurship into this tour of gas stations where we, every round is really focused on kind of what the next set of things they've got to do to unlock the next kind of round of funding. I think that's been a net negative for entrepreneurship as a whole. I think if you look at this last wave of unicorn chasing companies, we haven't ended up with, we haven't ended up with an outsized number of them that will be as durable as any generation previous to them, and yet they lived through effectively unlimited and free money. Money wasn't the thing that was holding most of these things back. And ultimately money wasn't a differentiator in terms of like who won and who lost. I think with indie, it's not to say that's not a way to build a business. It's certainly a way to do it. It's a way to express your ambition, but there's lots of other ways to do it. And when you look at, the previous generation of companies, when you look at the Microsofts, the Googles, the Amazon that are now the kind of pillars and maybe even, kind of aggregators of most of the value, those businesses hardly raised any venture capital. And those are the companies that endured. I got into venture after the dot-com crash. I watched Google and Amazon and a bunch of these come through, there were plenty of others that looked and could have likely have just as easily been the winners. And yet there was something about the way those founders built and financed those businesses that really set them apart. And I think people have been coached or been encouraged to believe that their ultimate ambition is a reflection of how much money they're raising, how much they're spending, and what valuation they're getting on each of those rounds. And ultimately, those are every bit the vanity metric that anything else is.